This episode is a trackpads.com production.
Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by trackpads.com. Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome. Today, we go to the waters off Okinawa in the Second World War for the story of the radar Picket Destroyers that faced the kamikazes first. Night is only just lifting when the destroyer's radar scopes begin to glow with trouble off Okinawa. The sea around her is gray and empty, except for the thin silhouette of one small warship holding its lonely post on the far edge of the fleet. Out here on the radar picket line, there are no battleships close by, no carrier decks in sight, only guns, antennas, radar screens, and sailors trying to see into the sky before the enemy reaches them. In the spring of 1945, when kamikaze attacks had become a grim routine, that lonely station felt like the edge of the world. On the bridge, officers studied the scopes and the horizon while the ship circled carefully around her assigned station. Farther south, out of sight, lay the crowded heart of the fleet. Transports, carriers, battleships, supply ships, and support vessels keeping the fight for Okinawa alive. Between those high-value ships and Japanese airfields stood the Picket Destroyers and a few small escorts. They were the outer wall. In the radar spaces, operators watched faint returns appear and fade on the screen. Any one of those echoes could be friendly aircraft, weather, or the beginning of a suicide raid. Every contact that held steady and grew stronger demanded attention. Every bearing and range mattered. The destroyer's job was to detect the threat early, warn the fleet, and guide fighters toward the attackers before they reached the main body. When a real raid formed, it often began as a vague smear on the scope, then became a cluster of echoes moving in from the direction of Japanese airfields. Cap fighters were scrambled and vectored by voice from the Pickets' radar room. Pilots turned and climbed on headings called out from a small plotting board at sea. On deck, gunners swung their mounts skyward, loaders slammed shells into hot breaches, and lookouts searched the brightening sky for the glint of wings. Everyone on board knew what happened if the fighters missed even a few attackers. Planes that slipped through might not continue toward the carriers. They could dive straight at the picket ships that had revealed themselves by radar emissions, radio calls, and gunfire. The day's pattern was brutally familiar. Warning, scramble, interception, then sometimes impact. Someone had to stand in the open, and off Okinawa, that burden fell on the radar Picket Destroyers. To understand why these ships were pushed so far forward, we have to step back to the larger campaign. By early 1945, the United States was fighting for Okinawa, the last major stepping stone before Japan's home islands. The island had to be taken and held as a base for airfields and anchorages that could support future operations. That meant weeks of land combat, constant resupply, and a huge fleet tied to one area with limited room to maneuver. Japan's response was to turn the sky into a weapon. From airfields on the home islands and nearby bases, Japanese forces launched wave after wave of kamikaze attacks intended to cripple the fleet before it could finish the Okinawa campaign. The radar picket line became the shield's outer rim, a loose ring of destroyers and smaller craft stationed miles from the main force. Their assignment was simple in theory and lethal in practice, detect incoming raids early, direct fighters to intercept them, and absorb whatever attacks broke through. If the pickets failed, the first warning of a kamikaze strike might be a plane screaming into a carrier deck, a battleship's superstructure, or a transport packed with troops and supplies. Marines and soldiers fighting inland depended on naval gunfire, supplies, reinforcements, and air support. If the fleet offshore was badly damaged or forced away, the ground battle would become far more dangerous. The line from radar screen to foxhole was real. Japanese planners hoped sustained suicide attacks could bleed the fleet badly enough to force it back from Okinawa. American admirals knew that losing carriers, transports, and support ships in large numbers could wreck the timetable of the Pacific War. So destroyers that had spent years escorting convoys, screening carriers, and hunting submarines became forward sentries in the Sky War. They steamed alone or in tiny groups, knowing that the better they did their job, the more likely they were to become the target. The radar picket system came from hard lessons learned across the Pacific. From the night battles in the Solomons to the kamikaze attacks off Leyte, the Navy had learned that warning time could mean survival. By Okinawa, ships had better radar sets and more experienced operators, but if all the ships stayed close together, warnings still came too late. Operation Iceberg forced planners to think of defense as a wide perimeter in the air, not just a screen on the sea. The answer was to send radar-equipped destroyers far ahead of the main body. Those ships were not passive observers. They also directed fighters. Fighter director teams used radar bearings, ranges, and estimated altitudes to talk cap aircraft toward incoming raids. Officers and enlisted specialists had to manage plotting boards, voice circuits, carrier communications, and the fast choreography of layered air defense. Gunners drilled for low, fast diving targets coming straight at the ship. When possible, smaller gunboats and rescue craft supported the pickets, but the destroyers remained the center of the forward shield. Geography made the job even harder. Okinawa lay within reach of Japanese airfields on Kyushu and Formosa, giving attackers multiple routes and launch points. The American fleet, meanwhile, had to remain close enough to support troops ashore. To cover likely approaches, the picket line became a necklace of exposed stations, often held by one or two destroyers at a time. Crews rotated through fire support, screening, and picket duty, but the most dangerous posts were always waiting. On a hard day, the first warning came in a calm voice from the radar room. Contacts were forming at long range. Fighters already airborne were vectored out to intercept. For a few minutes, the destroyer might seem almost peaceful, her guns silent, while dogfights formed far away. Every enemy plane shot down by those fighters was one less aircraft that might reach the ship. But the quiet never felt secure. Sometimes the system worked, and the raids never reached the picket line. But Okinawa produced too many days when the sky became crowded despite every effort. Some Japanese pilots came in low under clouds or sea haze, appearing almost on top of the ships. Others came in numbers large enough to overwhelm the fighter screen, with stragglers and second waves pressing through after the first formations were broken. When that happened, the destroyer crew's world collapsed into seconds of instinct and training. Lookouts shouted bearings. Gun directors swung toward incoming shapes. 5-inch guns, 40mm Bofors, and 20mm Oerlikons opened fire. Tracers climbed into the sky and arced toward aircraft diving through smoke and shell bursts. One kamikaze might be hit and cartwheel into the sea short of the bow, throwing spray across the bridge. Another might come in low along the wake, using churned water and haze to mask its final approach. There was no time to celebrate a near miss because the next aircraft could already be diving. On some days, a single Picket Destroyer and her small consorts came under attack from several directions at once. Fighters broke up the first formations, but several attackers still pressed through. They came from different altitudes and bearings to divide the ship's fire and overload its tracking. Some were shot down close aboard, others were not. A kamikaze could slam into the aftergun mounts, tearing men and metal apart. A bomb could punch through upper decks and explode inside the ship, sending smoke, fire, and fragments through compartments that had been quiet only moments earlier. From the carriers and cruisers closer to Okinawa, officers heard broken voice reports and tried to imagine what was happening on stations they could not see. Fighter pilots sometimes looked down and saw a destroyer wreathed in smoke, still turning hard, still firing every gun that could bear. Nearby support craft moved in when the raids eased, bringing pumps, hoses, medical help, and rescue crews. Across the radar picket line, the details differed from ship to ship, but the purpose was the same. The destroyers drew enemy fury onto themselves and away from the crowded center of the fleet. The survival of those ships depended on more than courage. Radar gave crews precious warning. Fighter direction turned that warning into interceptions. Guns and ammunition turned the ships into floating anti-aircraft batteries. Proximity fuses helped shells explode near fast-moving targets, improving the chances of breaking up a diving attack before impact. Crews drilled until swinging a mount, loading, tracking, and firing became one continuous motion. Near misses were not luck alone. They were bought with training long before the raid arrived. Damage control was the last link in that chain. When hits landed, sailors fought fire, flooding, smoke, and wreckage with hoses, shoring timbers, portable pumps, and bare hands. They hauled wounded shipmates out of twisted spaces, sealed compartments, and worked to keep flames away from magazines and fuel. A ship that might have been lost earlier in the war could sometimes be stabilized, saved, and even returned to duty. Survival became a skill. As casualties mounted, commanders adjusted the system. They added support craft where they could, improved rescue coverage, and rotated destroyers through the worst stations to spread the strain. Air units refined their patterns, keeping fighters fueled, armed, and ready to launch as new contacts appeared on the scopes. The radar picket line bent under pressure, but it did not break. The crews themselves shaped the outcome. Captains kept battered ships on station after serious hits when radar still worked or guns could still fire. Stories spread through the fleet about destroyers enduring repeated attacks and somehow staying afloat. These were not just sea stories told after the war. They were messages passed from ship to ship, helping other crews prepare for their own turn on the line. The Japanese air arm paid a heavy price for every raid sent into that gauntlet. Kamikaze tactics were designed to trade aircraft and pilots for ships, but the Picket Destroyers helped tilt that exchange. Every raid broken up far from the main body, every suicide plane shot down before it reached a carrier or transport, weakened an air force that could not easily replace trained pilots or aircraft. The destroyers were bleeding, but they were also grinding down the enemy's striking power. When the battle for Okinawa ended, the cost was clear. Radar picket stations had suffered some of the heaviest damage of the campaign. Multiple destroyers were sunk, many more were scarred by fire and flooding, and hundreds of sailors were killed or wounded. Yet the main body of carriers, battleships, transports, and support ships remained intact enough to keep the land battles supplied and supported. Troops ashore held their beachheads, pushed inland, and secured the island. The price had been steep, but the fleet avoided the catastrophe Japanese planners hoped for. The radar picket line and its fighter cover did not make kamikaze attacks harmless. Nothing could. But they blunted the impact in a way that mattered. Many aircraft that might have found carrier decks, ammunition ships, or troop transports instead died against the guns of a single destroyer in a lonely patch of ocean. In that sense, the picket ships served as both shield and grinder. They absorbed punishment, gave warning, directed fighters, destroyed attackers, and protected the larger mission. After the war, navies studied what had happened off Okinawa. The idea of pushing sensors and defenders far out from the main force did not vanish. It evolved into radar picket ships, airborne early warning aircraft, and modern surface combatants with powerful air defense systems. The technology changed, but the principle remained. Put eyes and weapons forward, accept that those outposts carry greater risk, and use them to protect the larger force behind them. For students of military history and for sailors on modern warships, the radar Picket Destroyers at Okinawa offer a sobering lesson. Early warning and distributed defense are not abstract ideas. They are lived by crews who stand at the edge of danger so others can fight, land, supply, and survive.
The next time a visitor sees a destroyer's name on a memorial wall or a hull number in a museum exhibit, it is worth remembering what those so-called small ships carried. On the gray waters around Okinawa, they proved that the line between survival and disaster could run through a single radar screen, a gun crew, a damage control party, and a captain who refused to leave station while the sky was full of fire.
You can hear more narrated Headline Wednesday features through the Dispatch audio editions and carry these stories with you on the road or at your desk. For more conversation and daily facts, look for the United States Military History Group on LinkedIn and add your own perspective to the discussion.
Headline Wednesday is developed by trackpads.com as part of Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine.